Everybody, welcome to Mr. Heins Explains. We're going to talk about thrillers today. So make sure you've imported these notes from Notability, and let's get started. We are going to start by talking about some essential vocab, starting with the word suspense. And suspense simply is the feeling of anticipation. I apologize for this weird ink here. But it's a feeling of anticipation. It's this feeling that something is about to happen, okay? So, let's see if it works the second time. Anticipation. There we go. The feeling that something is about to happen. So it's this feeling that you're getting like, it's the raised hairs on the back of your neck. It's this idea like, oh my goodness, I know something's gonna happen. I'm not entirely sure what, but it's coming. Okay? Then plot twists are when we have an unexpected development in the story. This is when we have, for instance, like oh no, I expected this one thing to happen, and all of a sudden, like boom, completely different. That's a plot twist. Your third term is a cliffhanger, which a cliffhanger is a dramatic ending that leaves the story unfinished. Okay? And these usually happen either in series or in the end of chapters. Cliffhangers are when like suddenly you you are telling a story and all of a sudden you stop on this really heightened point. We use this a lot in like Dungeons and Dragons, where we're having a session, we're playing a game, we're telling a story, and all of a sudden something really excited is about to happen, and we just stop and we're saying, that's it. That's a cliffhanger. Okay? And then the last one for this slide is foreshadowing. Which is a hint at what might come later in the story. Okay? So this is where they're like, something's gonna happen. You might not know what's gonna happen, but it is gonna come, and I'm just gonna hint at it in the earlier parts. Okay? Second part, I'm gonna go a little bit quickly here. You can pause me as you need. Plot, as we've probably seen many times before, the plot is when we see the main events of the story. And another one that we've seen probably a lot is the setting, which is the place or surroundings where a story occurs. And it goes beyond that. It goes more than just being like, it occurs in a school. It also talks about time, because telling a story about a story in New York in the 1930s is going to be very different from New York in the 2000s. Weather is also a big deal, and also historical details. Because, for instance, if we're telling a story about the civil rights movement, we need to know those historical details as well. Okay? Then theme is when we talk about the central idea or ideas. There could be multiple in a story. And we convey this a lot through, we convey theme, we convey theme and some of these other ideas through moods, which is the way that we feel about a story. It's the general feeling a story creates, okay? Another way that we develop things like the plot and mood and theme is through what we call sensory language. And sensory language, simply enough, is how the author paints a picture in your mind. So sensory language, like it kind of suggests in the name, is language connected to the five senses. So if you don't remember what those five senses are, they're touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing. And this helps us, like I said, paint a picture. So if a character walks into a room with a dead body, the first thing that the author is probably going to tell you is that the smell of death hangs in the air. They're really going to try to paint that scene of a just terrible smell. Okay? And then your last bit of essential vocab for this is onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia. The word that doesn't make any sense from what it sounds versus what it is spelled. Onomatopoeia is a word formed from the sound it makes. And we'll talk about that more in detail later on, but this is a good example. Boom! That's the sound. It's also literally how it's spelled, okay? Then the other one is alliteration. And with alliteration, we're just talking about a repetition, repeating the same beginning words or sounds, okay? That's alliteration, okay? This second part is just right there. So, then we have two more terms. Let me clear up this. There we go. We have simile and metaphor. And simile is when we compare two or more different things. And the key with simile is we are using like or as to make a better description. This is like if I was telling you about how brave somebody is, I would say he was as brave as a lion to make a better description about how brave he is. Metaphors do it very, very, very similarly. It's when a word or phrase is compared to another one, to something that doesn't always make sense and doesn't always fit together, okay? In order to prove the... So again, going back to our brave as a lion example for a simile, metaphor goes the same way, except instead of saying brave as a lion, they will say he was a brave lion. Literally, he's not actually a brave lion, but by comparing the two, they showcases how brave he was. So, with that vocab in store, we're going to talk about this awesome quote by thriller author James Patterson. He writes that thrillers provide such a rich literary feast. There are all kinds, but what gives the variety of thrillers a common ground is this intensity of emotions they create, particularly those of apprehension and exhilaration, of excitement and breathlessness, all designed to generate that all-important thrill. By definition, if a thriller doesn't thrill, it's not doing its job. And with that quote, I'm going to have you pause here. You've got about half of a slide right here. I'd like you to write a few sentences as reflection. What do you feel that the quotation on the previous slide means? How might it fit with how we think about the way stories work? So take this quote. You can pause the video for a little while and write a reflection, just brief, doesn't have to be more than a couple sentences, right there. Alrighty, hopefully you've written your reflection here, and we're gonna move on. So why do we read thrillers? Well, first and foremost, we love that edge of your seat feeling. It's this idea that you're like, oh my goodness, what is coming next? And we build that by using suspense to build up to a climax to the story. Remember our plot diagram, the climax, the biggest part of the story? And how we do this is we use those literary devices like onomatopoeia, like simile, like metaphor. We use those literary devices to build that suspense. A lot of times the reason why we read thrillers is because we can identify with the protagonist. And if you don't remember what a protagonist is, that's okay. I'll remind you, protagonist is our main character. We can identify with them, whoever they might be in the story. And because we can identify it, it's gonna make us more likely to read on. And they're just fun. They're really, really fun to read. Okay, some famous examples are Stephen King, Dean Koontz. If you're a Sherlock Holmes fan, whether it's the Robert Downey Jr. version or the Benedict Cumberbatch version, that's technically thriller. Hunt for Red October and other like war movies are often thriller movies too. James Patterson is hugely popular. Alfred Hitchcock uh, created the genre for movies. Bourne trilogy, the Da Vinci Code, it's all over. We love thriller stories and movies in our society. So, diving deeper into thrillers, we are driving this through suspense, like we said before, which is something is about to happen. And we do this through those other vocab terms, like plot twists, cliffhangers, and foreshadowing. And we take all of these and it builds our feeling of not knowing what's coming. Okay? All of these things, by giving us plot twists, we can't predict what's going to come next. By giving us a cliffhanger, it by extension tells us like, oh, we don't know what's coming next. We're going to hint at what might come next, but you don't know when that's going to go through foreshadowing. All of these things build that feeling of not knowing what is happening next. And we've seen this throughout history. This is not just a new thing. Um, so foreshadowing is especially used everywhere. It's a hint at what happens next in the story, right? Or maybe not next. Let's put, instead of right next, because it doesn't have to be right next, we'll say later. And we see this in all genres, but they're everywhere in history too, in historical context too. Remember Romeo and Juliet? At the beginning of the play, when Romeo, Mercutio, and Benvolio are preparing to crash the Capulet party, and Benvolio and Mercutio are giving Romeo crap for being in love with Rosaline, Romeo utters this series of lines that hint at the fact that he's gonna die in the play. Sorry, spoiler alert. He hints at it in Act 1, Scene 4. His death is in Act 5, Scene 3. So he hints at it 4 acts before when he says, I fear too early, for my mind misgives some consequence. Yet hanging in the stars shall bitterly begin his fearful date with this night's revels, and expire the term, so end the term and the time of a despised life closed in my breast by some vile forfeit of untimely death. He's literally telling us, yeah, I feel like I'm about to die too soon in Act 1, and he dies in Act 5. That's foreshadowing, folks. Okay? You've probably seen this a lot before. This is a plot diagram. You're probably seeing this a million times before. We talked about it with the blogs. You have your exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and the resolution. Sure. But it's still worth mentioning that, especially when you're talking about suspense, you build it here in the rising action. They go hand in hand. All right? Whoop. Now, talking about going onward, we're going to talk about setting. And setting, thrillers trying to use the following in this setting. First of all, oftentimes we use a threatening atmosphere. It's got to be spooky. It promises violence. Possibly. So it might not always promise violence, but it's got to be a threatening atmosphere. It's got to be a dangerous situation. It can't just be like sunshine and daisies. That's not going to work. It's got to be dangerous situations, such as a trap being set, or life being threatened. And they do this by using the sensory language to help build a mood. And that mood is what is going to really propel it forward. So think about this picture right here. We are setting the mood of these characters are all in black. There's a smoke, there's fog, it's dark, you can't see the faces. It's not exactly the most pleasant picture to look at. That's by purpose. They don't just accidentally do those things. Now, talking about some themes. We got plenty of them. And these are obviously just some of the many. So just keep that in mind. It's not always about vengeance or revenge here, but oftentimes it is. Oftentimes characters in thrillers have an obsession with something, or oftentimes they've gone insane for one reason or another. A lot of characters you see in thrillers are also battling some personal things or have some personal dilemmas to solve. And that's often like something that propels them forward. And oftentimes, like in the Da Vinci Code, they're on the run. And like I said, these are just a couple of them that we see in thrillers. All right, almost done. So why do we use other literary devices? We've talked about the basic ones. Well, things like onomatopoeia, onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia helps heighten our senses and pull the reader into the story more. What I mean by that is, when we use words like bang, crash, or zoom, there's a reason behind that. Our brains automatically see that and go, ah, okay, there's a bang there, there's a crash there, there's someone zooming along, and we are pulled into the story. We also do this through alliteration, which alliteration gives readers a sign of something they should pay particular attention to. And the reason why we do this is our human brains love patterns. So Peter Piper picked a pail of pickled peppers. A sheep should sleep in the shed. We love patterns. Whenever we see patterns, whether it's consciously or not, we always say, oh, yep, got to pay attention to that. And that's what alliteration does. It just points out something we should pay attention to. Okay? And then last but not least, we have, of course, our similes and metaphors. So similes help add description to words or phrases to make them more interesting. Like I said, the soldiers were as brave as lions. And they use like or as. If it doesn't have a like or as, it's not a simile. On the flip side, metaphors help emphasize the author's point. And the way that we do this, a good example of a metaphor is the phrase raining cats and dogs. Now, obviously, it can't literally rain cats and dogs, but by saying cats and dogs, we're really emphasizing, hey, it is pouring outside. Okay? That's all we got for notes today. I hope you enjoy your short stories that we read in the next next week or two. Go ahead and submit this for a check.